It all started the moment Karen moved into the neighborhood, a new face with a shiny car and an attitude bigger than the house she'd just bought. The first thing she did was walk around like she owned the place, but not in the typical new neighbor way. No, Karen wasn't here to blend in or make friends. She was here to enforce her idea of what the neighborhood should be, and that idea didn't leave room for anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision. It was like she was trying to claim ownership of the entire community, territory she believed belonged to people like her, and it wasn't long before she started making life miserable for those who didn't fall in line. That included me, the black man who had lived in the neighborhood for years and who, in her eyes, didn't belong. At first, it was just the little things, the kind of stuff that makes you think, maybe I'm imagining this. But I wasn't. I wasn't imagining the way she would glare when she passed by my house, like I was doing something wrong just by existing. She'd casually mention the rules every time we crossed paths, not rules about the neighborhood. No, those were secondary. She'd talk about rules as if she thought she was the queen of this little world, the one who decided who got to be here and who didn't. And the more I heard her talk, the more I realized that she didn't just care about community guidelines. She cared about power, control, and making sure that power was firmly in her hands. It wasn't long before Karen started taking her desire for control to another level. A few weeks after her arrival, the first letter showed up in my mailbox. It looked official enough, stamped with the HOA logo and all the bells and whistles to make it seem like it meant business. But as soon as I read the opening line, I knew something was off. The letter claimed I was required to register my property with the Oak Ridge HOA, and there was a fine attached for $250. A fine for what? The yard was well kept, the driveway was clean, and my truck was parked neatly in front of the house. There was no explanation, just a demand. I almost laughed at the audacity, but this wasn't just a random letter. This was a warning. Karen had clearly made it her mission to make my life difficult, and she was using her HOA role to do it. I threw the letter away, not bothering to respond. I didn't need to justify myself to anyone, especially not her. But it didn't stop there. The next week, another letter showed up, this time claiming that I'd violated some HOA regulation about exterior modifications. I hadn't made any modifications. My house was exactly as it had been when I bought it. Another $150 fine, just for good measure. Then came the next violation notice, and the next, each one more absurd than the last. One fine for excessive noise. There was barely any noise coming from my house at all. I worked late shifts, only home during odd hours. The idea that I was disturbing the peace was ridiculous, but Karen wasn't interested in the truth. She was interested in pushing me, seeing if I would break, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I tossed every notice straight into the trash, hoping that would be the end of it. But Karen didn't give up. She wasn't the type to take no for an answer. She wasn't going to stop just because I ignored her petty letters. No, she stepped up her game. One morning, I stepped outside to find her standing in my driveway. Clipboard in hand, she was watching me from the foot of my driveway like some kind of neighborhood patrol officer. Her eyes didn't leave me as I walked toward her, and there was a smugness in her gaze, like she thought I was going to fold right then and there. She had that look on her face, the look that said she was about to lay down the law. "I've been trying to reach you about your outstanding fines," she said, her voice sweet, but carrying that edge that told me she wasn't here to talk. She was here to control. I folded my arms, taking my time, letting her know that I wasn't intimidated. "I'm not part of your HOA," I said flatly, making sure she heard every word. Her smile didn't even falter. "Well," she said with that same fake sweetness, "it's only fair that everyone contributes to the neighborhood's upkeep." The way she said fair made my skin crawl. It wasn't about fairness. It wasn't about upkeep. It was about her, about making sure I knew my place in the neighborhood. I let out a small, humorless laugh. "Fair?" I asked, shaking my head. "I don't owe you anything." Karen's smile slipped for just a second, and in that moment, I saw something darker in her eyes. Her grip tightened around her clipboard, and I could feel the tension in the air. For a brief moment, I thought maybe she was going to snap, but then just as quickly, she regained her composure and adjusted her blazer, as if trying to remind herself that she was still in control. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if she were trying to intimidate me. I do hope you reconsider. You wouldn't want to make things difficult for yourself." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't about property fines or community guidelines. This was about control. This was about her wanting to make me bend to her will, wanting to remind me that in her eyes, I was the problem. "Karen," I said, my voice low, calm but firm, "if I get one more letter like this, I'll be filing a harassment complaint." She straightened up at that, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Without another word, she turned and walked back down the driveway, her heels clicking against the pavement, but I could see the rage behind her stiff posture. I thought that would be the end of it, that Karen would back off. But I was wrong. A week later, I walked outside to find garbage strewn across my front lawn. It wasn't just trash, it was deliberate. It was like she was sending a message that said, "I can do whatever I want, and you can't stop me." I didn't react though. I just cleaned it up and went about my day, but it didn't stop there. The next day, my mailbox was knocked over, and I began noticing that the neighbors were giving me strange looks. The whispers started. Every time I passed by, people would glance away, or some would lower their heads as if they were avoiding eye contact. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then Jim, an older guy who had lived in the neighborhood forever, caught me at the gas station. He looked at me sympathetically as he filled up his truck. "You'll want to take care of things soon," he said. "Karen's been telling everyone you're having legal problems." He paused, then added quietly, "She even said something about a warrant." "A warrant?" I blinked, stunned. "A warrant for what?" I asked. Jim just shook his head, warning me that Karen was stirring up trouble. It wasn't just me, it was anyone who didn't fit her mold, and I was her latest target. What I didn't know yet was that things were about to take a much darker turn. The next few days felt like a slow boil, a constant pressure mounting, but I refused to let Karen's antics get to me. I kept my head down, focused on my work, and did my best to ignore the harassment, but it wasn't just the letters anymore. It wasn't just petty fines for non-existent violations. Karen's efforts had evolved into something far more sinister. I came home one morning, ready to enjoy a quiet weekend, only to find my front yard littered with garbage. It wasn't the usual stray bag or piece of plastic that might blow across from a neighbor's trash bin. It was an entire pile, like someone had emptied out their own trash cans and dumped it all in front of my house. It was deliberate. It was an act of pure spite. I stood there, staring at the mess, trying to figure out what kind of sick person would do this. And there, right at the center of the garbage heap, was an empty envelope from the HOA. It felt like a slap in the face. I wasn't just dealing with petty administrative annoyances anymore. I was dealing with someone who was willing to try and break me down by any means necessary, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me upset. I picked up the trash, one bag at a time, and went about my day. I didn't let it ruin my weekend, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The damage was deliberate, the message loud and clear. Karen wasn't going to stop until she had gotten exactly what she wanted. It wasn't enough for her to make my life difficult with fines and fake violations. Now she was trying to intimidate me, to break me mentally. She wanted me to feel powerless, to feel like I was a stranger in my own home. It was a game to her, and I was her target. The very next week, my mailbox was knocked over. At first, I thought maybe it was an accident. Maybe someone had backed out of their driveway too fast. Maybe some kids had been playing a prank. But when I checked the position of the mailbox and saw that it had been deliberately tipped over and crushed under the weight of a large rock, I knew this wasn't just random vandalism. It was personal. This wasn't just a neighborhood prank. This was someone sending a message. And that someone, without a doubt, was Karen. I could feel the anger building, but I forced myself to stay calm. She wasn't going to win. She wasn't going to make me fold. But the strangest part was the way the rest of the neighborhood seemed to react. They weren't exactly speaking up, but they weren't being subtle either. Every time I walked down the street, I noticed more people staring at me, giving me these sideways glances, as if they were waiting for something to happen. There was this palpable tension in the air, like people were afraid to look me in the eye. I wasn't imagining it. The whispers started. It was small at first, snippets of conversations caught as I walked by, a few hushed words about the troublemaker on the block. I caught more than one neighbor shooting me an apologetic glance as I passed by, like they were silently trying to say they didn't believe the rumors. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. It was as though Karen's words were starting to infect the entire neighborhood, and I wasn't just imagining it when I overheard Jim, the older guy down the block, talking to me at the gas station. His voice was low, and he kept glancing around like he didn't want to be overheard. "You need to be careful," he said, his voice full of concern. "Karen's been telling people you've got legal trouble, that you're avoiding fines. She's even got people talking about a warrant. You should really get things sorted out before it gets worse." A warrant? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had never done anything wrong. Yet somehow Karen had convinced the whole neighborhood that I was the one causing trouble. She had turned the entire block against me, painting me as the villain for no other reason than the fact that I was different. The fact that I didn't fit her idea of who should belong here. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was racial discrimination masked behind the guise of HOA enforcement. The next morning I received a letter. It was from the Oak Ridge HOA's legal department. It looked official enough, stamped with the same logo, the same intimidating tone. But when I opened it, I felt my blood run cold. It claimed that because I had failed to pay my fines, a warrant had been issued for my arrest. The letter was full of legal jargon, full of threats, and full of lies. A warrant? For what? I had paid my property taxes on time. My lawn was perfect. I had never received any official notice from anyone in law enforcement. This was Karen's game, her attempt to push me into a corner. She was getting desperate now, pulling out all the stops to try and intimidate me into submission. But I wasn't about to let her win. I knew this was a bluff, a pathetic attempt to get me to crack. But it was more than that. It was her racism showing through. She didn't think I would fight back. She didn't think I was the type to stand up to her. I could have called it out right then and there, called the HOA and exposed Karen's lies. But I decided to play it smart. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a confrontation yet. Instead, I waited. I wanted to see just how far she would go. I knew she wouldn't stop at just fake fines. She'd keep pushing, keep escalating until she hit a point where she would finally overstep. And when she did, I would be ready. That same day, I saw her again. This time, she was standing on the sidewalk across the street, clipboard in hand, staring directly at my house. She didn't look away when I caught her eye. She wanted me to know she was watching. She wanted to remind me that she still had power over me. I crossed the street, walked over to her, and kept my face neutral. "What is it now, Karen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled her fake smile, the one that never reached her eyes. "Just thought I'd remind you," she said sweetly. "You're still in violation of several HOA codes. I just wanted to give you a heads up before we escalate things." I looked her square in the eye and said, "I don't care about your HOA. Stop harassing me." Her smile faltered for just a moment, but it didn't last. She quickly regained her composure, adjusting her blazer and smoothing her hair. "Well, I'm just doing my job," she said, but the malice in her tone was unmistakable. I took a deep breath, keeping my cool. "And I'm going to file a harassment complaint if you don't stop this nonsense. You don't have any power over me." She didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, staring at me. Then, with a huff, she turned on her heel and walked back down the street, but I knew she wasn't done. This was far from over. And sure enough, it wasn't. The very next day, I found another letter in my mailbox, this one more threatening than the last, but it wasn't just fines anymore. This one told me that if I didn't comply with the HOA's demands, they would take further legal action, possibly involving law enforcement. I was done. I wasn't just fighting for my property anymore. I was fighting against a racist bully who thought she could intimidate me because I was black. She thought I would roll over, but I wasn't going to let that happen. I decided it was time to take a stand. If Karen wanted to escalate things, then fine. Let's see how she liked playing with the wrong person. It wasn't long before Karen's little game escalated from petty harassment to something far more dangerous. The moment I received that letter claiming there was a warrant out for my arrest, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just the fact that she was continuing to target me. It was the sheer audacity of her actions. A warrant? For what? I had done nothing wrong. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just trying to get me to pay fines. She was trying to break me, to force me into submission. She had already spread lies about me, tried to turn the neighborhood against me, and now she was resorting to something even worse, attempting to weaponize the law against me. She thought I would be scared, that I would panic and back down, but what she didn't know was that I wasn't the kind of person who folds under pressure. And that's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this go. Not now, not ever. I wasn't going to call her out immediately, though. No, I decided to sit back and let her dig her own grave. I knew she wouldn't stop at just sending fake fines and warnings. She was going to keep pushing, and I was going to let her. The more she pushed, the more she would expose herself, and when the time was right, I would strike back. I wasn't going to let Karen's actions slide, but I also wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of an immediate confrontation. No, I'd let her think she had the upper hand until the moment I was ready to take her down. The very next day, another letter came. This one was more brazen, more desperate. It claimed that my failure to pay the fines had now escalated to a legal issue, and that the HOA was about to take further legal action. I wasn't intimidated by the letter. I had already seen through Karen's game, and this was just more of the same. But this time, I wasn't going to let her win. This wasn't just about fighting back. It was about showing Karen that her abuse of power wasn't going to be tolerated. She didn't know it yet, but I had already taken the first steps to make sure her little empire of lies came crashing down. Then, one morning, I stepped outside and found two men standing in my driveway, their faces grim and their uniforms poorly fitting. One of them had a clipboard in his hands, and the other had a cheap plastic badge clipped to his belt. They didn't look like police officers. They didn't even look like they belonged in any kind of law enforcement. But they weren't here by accident. They were here because Karen had sent them, hoping that I would be intimidated. They weren't real officers. They were just puppets in Karen's game, but they didn't know that. When they saw me, their eyes flickered with that same mixture of confidence and hesitation, like they weren't quite sure what to expect from me. The taller one cleared his throat, trying to sound authoritative, but there was a nervousness in his voice that he couldn't hide. "Are you the homeowner here?" he asked, the words leaving his mouth slowly, like he was trying to figure out how to phrase it without sounding completely ridiculous. I folded my arms and stared back at him, my eyes locked onto his. "Who's asking?" I replied, my voice steady but full of an edge that made it clear I wasn't playing her game. The taller one straightened up, his posture stiffening. "We're with the HOA Enforcement Division," he said, his tone trying to sound official but coming off as laughable. "We're here to discuss your outstanding violations." I raised an eyebrow, trying not to smirk at the absurdity of it all. "HOA Enforcement Division?" I repeated, incredulous. I took a step forward, my arms still crossed. "What exactly does that mean? Are you trying to tell me you're the police?" The shorter guy tried to act tough, puffing out his chest as if it would make him seem more intimidating. "We have an active warrant for your arrest," he said, but I could see the fear behind his words. I wasn't intimidated by their cheap badges or their fake authority. I wasn't going to be pushed around by people who thought they could just play dress up and pretend to be law enforcement. "You don't say," I said, raising an eyebrow and crossing my arms even tighter. "So, you're telling me that the HOA has the power to arrest me now?" The two men shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. I could almost see the gears turning in their heads as they tried to figure out how to explain their ridiculous claim without sounding like complete fools. After a few moments of awkward silence, the taller guy tried to explain. Per HOA code violations, you've repeatedly failed to comply with the community regulations, and now we're here to bring you in." I stared at him, waiting for him to continue, but he didn't. Instead, he stood there, looking at me like he expected me to just accept it. I couldn't help but laugh, but I didn't let it show too much. I wanted them to sweat. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. "Is that so?" I said. "Well then, let me see the warrant." The two men froze. They clearly weren't expecting that question. The shorter guy blinked in confusion. "You already got the notice," he said, trying to cover up his nervousness. No, no, I said, shaking my head. The real one. The court-issued arrest warrant. The taller man shifted on his feet, looking uncomfortable. The HOA board issued it, he stammered. I couldn't help but smirk at the absurdity. Oh, the HOA board, I repeated. Does the HOA have the legal authority to issue arrests? They both hesitated, their eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. They were trying to figure out how to explain the impossible without making themselves look ridiculous. I let them sweat for a few more seconds before I decided to put an end to their little charade. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my badge, not the cheap plastic kind they were sporting, but a real U.S. Marshal's badge. I held it up in front of them, making sure they saw it clearly. The moment they saw it, their faces drained of color. The taller one looked like he had seen a ghost, and the shorter one took a step back, his eyes widening in shock. You two just attempted to detain a federal officer, I said calmly, watching as the reality of the situation sank in. The taller one's mouth fell open, but he didn't say a word. The shorter one turned on his heel and bolted down the street. They didn't even try to fight it, they just ran. I stood there for a moment watching them scramble away like two terrified children caught in a lie, but I wasn't done yet. I had them, and now I was going to make sure Karen understood just how badly she had messed up. I wasn't just going to let these two go. I had their names, and I was going to use them to expose everything. But I didn't just stop at the two fake officers. Oh no, I was going to dig deeper. I had a feeling this wasn't just a case of one woman trying to control a neighborhood. There was something bigger going on, and Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life by crossing the line. Now it was time to take her down. As soon as Karen's two fake officers ran off, I knew the moment of truth was coming. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. I had already planned my next move, and now it was time to make it all come crashing down on her. I could have gone straight to Karen's house, confronted her, and demanded answers, but that would have been too easy. She would have just played the victim, tried to manipulate her way out of it. No, I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. I needed to hit her where it hurt, right at the heart of her false authority. I needed to expose her for what she truly was, a liar, a fraud, and a racist bully who had been terrorizing this neighborhood for far too long. I started with the names of the two fake officers. They were part of the scam, a simple part of the puzzle that Karen had put together in her desperate attempt to control and intimidate anyone she deemed unworthy of being in the neighborhood. But when I ran their names through a quick search, I realized I had stumbled onto something far more significant than I'd initially anticipated. The officers weren't just random hired hands. No, they were part of a much bigger operation, one that Karen had been running for months, possibly even years. This wasn't just a series of small-time violations and petty fines. This was a full-blown extortion scheme. I started digging deeper, tracing back through the records, the public complaints, and the financial documents. What I uncovered made my blood run cold. Karen had been using these fake violations, these fake officers, and even fake legal threats to scare homeowners into compliance. The goal wasn't just to force them to pay fines, it was to take their homes. Karen was running an operation where she would target homeowners who refused to join her HOA or who didn't follow her arbitrary rules. If they ignored her fines, she'd escalate, first with threats, then with these fake arrests, and ultimately, she'd seize their properties. Once she had control, she'd resell the homes to approved buyers for a fraction of their value. It was organized theft, and Karen had been doing it for a long time. The worst part? She'd been getting away with it. I could feel the anger building inside me, but I knew I had to keep my head cool. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every person she had targeted, every home she had stolen, and every lie she had spread. It was time to stop her once and for all. I wasn't going to confront Karen head on just yet. I needed to get more evidence to make sure that when the time came, there would be no way for her to wiggle out of the consequences. I made a few calls to local authorities, even reaching out to the district attorney's office. I wanted to make sure that when Karen finally realized she had crossed the line, there would be real consequences. I also knew that if I was going to take her down, I had to expose her lies in front of everyone, make sure the whole neighborhood knew exactly who they were dealing with. Karen wasn't just a nuisance anymore. She was a criminal, and the entire neighborhood needed to know the truth. As I dug deeper into the HOA's records, I uncovered something that shocked me even more. Karen wasn't working alone. She had the support of a local judge, someone who had repeatedly ruled in her favor during legal disputes involving the HOA. This judge had signed off on property seizures without even checking the facts. It was clear now, Karen wasn't just a petty HOA president. She had been using her position to manipulate the legal system, and this judge had been complicit in her scheme. It was a corrupt system that had been enabling her to carry out her extortion operation without fear of repercussions. It was time to act. I baited Karen, setting up the perfect trap to expose everything she had done. I took one of her fake violation notices, the latest one she had sent me, and I made it look like I was finally giving in. I sent a formal request for a hearing, making her believe that I was willing to negotiate, but in reality, I had no intention of negotiating. I was setting her up for her fall. I wanted to make sure she thought she had the upper hand, that she was going to get away with everything. But when the day of the hearing arrived, she was going to realize how badly she had underestimated me. The day before the supposed hearing, I made a few more calls, making sure everything was in place. I contacted local law enforcement to ensure they would be ready, and I coordinated with the district attorney's office and the U.S. attorney's office. What Karen didn't know was that I wasn't just fighting for my property. I was about to bring down her entire operation. This was bigger than just me. This was about stopping a corrupt system that had been terrorizing the entire neighborhood. I wasn't going to let her get away with it any longer. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, I walked in calmly, dressed in plain clothes, not giving away anything to Karen or her little band of corrupt HOA board members. Karen was already seated at the head of the table, her usual smug expression plastered on her face. She looked at me with that look of superiority, the same look she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. But this time, there was something different. The table was full of her board members, and they all had that same forced smile on their faces. They knew what was coming, but they didn't know how bad it would be. Karen immediately launched into her speech, reading off a list of fabricated violations and inflated fines, trying to make me look like the bad guy. She used all the legal-sounding terms: breach of contract, community infractions, failure to comply with HOA codes. But none of it mattered. None of it was real. It was all a lie, and I could see the panic starting to set in on her face. She was talking faster, trying to get through her list of fake charges as quickly as possible. But I wasn't listening to her. I was watching her. Watching the way she fidgeted when she glanced at the clock, the way she kept checking the door, like she was waiting for someone. I knew exactly what she was up to. She wasn't trying to convince me. She was stalling, hoping that the fake HOA police would show up at the last minute, ready to arrest me, just like she had planned. But I wasn't falling for it. I stood up slowly, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm, "let me guess. The HOA police are on their way to escort me out of here, aren't they?" The room went silent. I could see Karen's eyes flicker toward the door, her face going pale. For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. She wasn't in control anymore. "I'll take that as a yes," I said, checking my watch. "But before they get here, why don't we call in some real professionals?" Just as I finished speaking, the doors to the room burst open and uniformed officers flooded in. The look on Karen's face was priceless. Her smirk faltered, her eyes going wide with panic. The board members looked like they were about to jump out of their seats. One of them actually ducked under the table, trying to hide from the incoming officers. But it was too late. The officers were here, and they weren't here to arrest me. They were here to arrest Karen. The U.S. attorney stepped forward, holding up an arrest warrant with Karen's name on it. "Karen Whitmore," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You are under arrest for fraud, extortion, impersonating law enforcement, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but she couldn't find the words to defend herself. No, she stammered. "This is all a misunderstanding." "Oh, we understand," I said, crossing my arms. "You've been running a fake legal operation to intimidate and steal from homeowners. You've been trying to frame me with bogus charges and fake arrests. Not a good look, Karen." The officers moved in, and I watched as they cuffed her, finally taking her away. The room was dead silent. The board members who had once sided with her were now silent too, their faces full of shock and regret. Karen had finally been exposed, and her reign of terror was over. As the doors closed behind her, the tension in the room lifted. People began talking, and the truth finally came out. Neighbors started stepping forward, telling their stories of how they had been harassed, bullied, and threatened by Karen. People who had been too scared to speak up before were now sharing their experiences. I didn't just win, we all won. The HOA was gone, and Karen's criminal operation had been exposed. It wasn't just about me getting justice, it was about every homeowner who had been wronged. Karen thought she was untouchable, but she had underestimated the one person who wouldn't let her get away with it. She thought she could play the game, but she never saw the real law coming for her. And now she was paying the price for everything she had done.